My favorite video game series is The Legend of Zelda, and I've been a fan of that game since the Nintendo Entertainment System all the way to now. And throughout the years, I've purchased probably every single mainline Zelda entry that's come out for the consoles. I will admit that some of the portable versions, I have skipped some of those. But the mainline entries, I've been heavily invested in over the years, and it's one of those titles that whenever I'd hear Nintendo announcing a new Zelda release, it got me incredibly excited, and it became one of those things where I felt like a kid again, anticipating what this grand adventure was going to be when there was a new Zelda on the horizon. And one of the games in particular in the Zelda series that I probably held the most anticipation for leading up to its release was Twilight Princess. And that game in particular, it had a lot of unique aspects to it and a lot of hype because of these aspects that, in my mind, at that time period, made it seem like it was bigger than any other Zelda title was ever going to be. And yes, I'm aware you have your Breath of the Wild, your Tears of the Kingdoms, which massively increased the scale of the world. But at the era of GameCube and at the time period that it was coming out, Twilight Princess was looking like basically it was taking everything Ocarina of Time was trying to do, but was held back by technological limitations, and bringing that into modern hardware, or modern for the time, and basically capitalizing on the GameCube's horsepower to really deliver something truly special. And in this video, I'm going to go over why Twilight Princess to me remains one of the best Zelda titles, but also what makes it so special amongst so many incredible entries in the Zelda series. So let's take a look. When Twilight Princess was originally announced, I believe I was about 15 or 16 years old, and at that time period when it was unveiled, there was a lot of hype surrounding it, and a lot of that hype actually came from the fact that fans, myself included, were expecting a sort of realistic or somewhat realistic Zelda title running on the GameCube hardware, and instead what we got was the Wind Waker, and part of that all came from the Space World 2000 demo that showed and depicted Link and Ganondorf in a more realistic visual display. And so a lot of gamers assumed that when GameCube got a Zelda, it was going to look like that, but instead we ended up getting Wind Waker at that time. So there were a lot of people, myself included, who were still holding out that we would see a somewhat realistic Zelda title making its way to GameCube. And so when that original trailer debuted for Twilight Princess, which at that time I believe was just known as like Zelda 2005 or Zelda 2006 for most people, but at that time when that debuted, it was pretty much for a lot of gamers like Nintendo delivering on that promise of the Zelda that a lot of people were expecting was going to come to GameCube. And I remember being incredibly hyped up by that initial video, and part of the reasons for that were it looked like we were getting back to this large, vast Hyrule that a lot of people were expecting the GameCube to have when it came to a Zelda game. And it looked like Nintendo was really trying to maximize how they could make Zelda play using the GameCube hardware. And in a lot of ways, it felt like this was the Zelda that Nintendo wanted to deliver on the N64, but couldn't due to technological limitations. And that hype continued because you had multiple trailers following, and you also had a lot of great interviews and great pieces of information coming from Nintendo that really hyped this game up, and it really made it seem like this was going to be the largest and best Zelda ever made. And when the game debuted on the GameCube and the Wii, it came out on the Wii first, there was that whole weird thing where Nintendo originally was slating it for GameCube, then held it back so they could boost Wii sales. But when it came out for those consoles, I actually waited for the GameCube version. To me, that seemed like the real way to play it. That was the original way that Nintendo intended for people to play it. And so for me, that was the version I held out for. And when I played that game for the first time, it felt a lot different, but very similar to a lot of the other Zeldas. And what I mean by that is, I know some people in hindsight or in retrospect criticized that Twilight Princess feels like a bit of a slow burn, but I felt like that world building and building around the whole different dimension between the Twilight realm and the normal realms, I felt like that was necessary, and that was something that really added a different layer of emotion to this Zelda title. And the one thing that I really liked about Twilight Princess was, yes, it evolved on a lot of the things that made Ocarina of Time great, but it also capitalized on some of the weirdness or some of the even darkness of Majora's Mask and combined these two things to really deliver a more mature Zelda experience, which at that point in time, I was getting a lot older. By the time that game actually came out, I was about 16 or 17. And so this game felt like a game I was growing up with actually maturing. It didn't feel like a step back like we had with Wind Waker, which was a fantastic game in its own right. But Wind Waker did feel quite child-friendly overall, whereas Twilight Princess felt like it was maturing with the audience that grew up on that Zelda series. And I really appreciated that. I felt like that was something that made the game feel very unique and made it feel very, at that point in time, in my life, very appealing. But the other thing that I do want to highlight is that the game's world felt very exciting. And what I mean is, it felt vibrant, it felt lively. Little touches like being able to see the overcast of clouds go across Hyrule felt to me like this was a grand world, a large world, and all the different areas just felt large. It didn't feel like we were confined to little set pieces or little segmented off areas. And yes, that was a thing in this game, but Nintendo did a good job of making it feel like you were a part of this large world. And I'm aware that if you compare this Zelda to Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, yes, the world building is going to seem a lot different in the way that we have a gargantuan map to explore in the Breath of the Wilds and Tears of the Kingdoms that you don't really get in any other Zelda game. And so Twilight Princess, in comparison, might feel a little stunted. But for that period of time, it didn't. For that period of time, it felt like you were in this large, engrossing world, and felt like you were in this world that was what I always remembered Ocarina of Time being, but it absolutely wasn't. And that to me felt special. I enjoyed going around on horseback and encountering different enemies and finding different things throughout Hyrule and all the surrounding areas. And I felt like all the different characters that you met along the way and all the different areas, towns, and the Hyrule Castle town, and all those things felt like this was a very lively and lived-in world. And that was one of my biggest things that I disliked about, Wind Waker, and even to a bigger extent in hindsight, it was one of the things that I disliked about Ocarina of Time. Hyrule didn't really feel as lively as I remembered it, having gone back to it at that time period and trying to revisit it. But this one did, and it felt like this was a massive grand adventure, which to me made this Zelda title feel just very special, and it made it feel like one of the best examples of what I always wanted a Zelda game to be at that time period. Now, moving a bit further though as well, I also liked the way Nintendo incorporated a lot of the combat. It sounds trivial maybe now when you look at how Zelda's progressed, but when Twilight Princess came out, being able to use your sword on horseback and take on waves of enemies in this vast Hyrule field was something to me that it felt epic. It felt like this incredible adventure that you were able to really get through with a high level of combat that, yes, the previous Zelda games, you always used your Master Sword, and in Wind Waker, you were able even to pick up random weapons. But Twilight Princess's combat felt refined. And it didn't just feel refined on the gimmick that you could use your sword on your sword on horseback, but it also felt refined in that you learned all these different techniques. You learned these, advanced counters, and all these things when you started bringing them together made you really feel like you were this warrior trying to fight against evil in this massive, massive world. And that was an element to this game that I think oftentimes in some cases is a little underrated. I felt like the combat for Twilight Princess overall was just exciting to execute and exciting to play. Now, I do want to highlight, a lot of my opinion of these things is coming from the GameCube version. I've played through the Wii version. Truth be told, I'm not as excited or as fond of that version purely because I think the control scheme was god-awful. The GameCube version to me, though, being able to execute these counters and moves and everything else was the perfect way to play this, and it felt so good on that console at that time period. And even now, I don't feel like even Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom did as good of a job capitalizing on the combat like Twilight Princess did. And I think the most important and final thing that I really do want to emphasize with Twilight Princess is I felt like this game had probably some of the best dungeons. Almost every single dungeon in this game to me was memorable, and it was well structured, well paced. The boss fights to me were fantastic. And when I think back to some of the most exciting Zelda dungeons, I constantly drift back to Twilight Princess. And I think that this to me was, again, Nintendo really looking at a phenomenal game like Ocarina of Time, which, by the way, I keep comparing these two, but Ocarina of Time is my favorite game of all time. But I felt like they looked at Ocarina of Time and looked at what made these areas special, what made these dungeons special. And they advanced on them in a way that felt just perfect. And when you look at even like the Snow Peak ruins in Twilight Princess, and you look at how Nintendo was able to capture such a phenomenal atmosphere, as well as having intricate puzzles and unique areas and enemies to face throughout that area or any of the dungeons, it felt like a masterclass in level design. And it's something that, to me, Nintendo still hasn't been able to recapture that high level of Zelda dungeons since. I'm aware Tears of the Kingdom and especially Breath of the Wild were in a lot of ways a lot more experimental, but they still didn't capture the same magic that Twilight Princess did when it came to its dungeons. And one thing I want to end this off with, and just something I want to highlight, because I've heard this argument and I don't know if I disagree with it, and it's that Twilight Princess is unique in the fact that it basically took everything good about Zelda and improved upon it at that time period, but in a lot of ways it didn't really advance Zelda forward. And I don't fully disagree with that statement, but I also don't think that Nintendo always needs to really push the envelope in some way that we get a new Zelda based off of gimmick, right? My opinion was Skyward Sword was a pretty god-awful Zelda entry. They experimented and built this game off of gimmick, trying to keep the series fresh, and in my opinion, it did not work. It didn't feel good, it didn't play well, and the world was probably one of the most bland versions of Zelda that I've ever experienced. Whereas Twilight Princess looked at the things that it was doing well within the Zelda series up until that point, and it capitalized on them. It took the vastness of the world of a Wind Waker, for example, but made it feel intuitive. And it took the weirdness and darkness of a Majora's Mask and made it a solid plot device. And it took the wonder and the exciting world building of Ocarina of Time, and it maximized on that. And in a lot of ways, I think that Twilight Princess felt almost like a swan song, or how do I say it? Felt like an ode. That's what I'm trying to get at. An ode to previous Zelda titles before it. And it felt almost like a love letter to those games. And it felt like it did so many things so well and sharpened so many things of previous Zelda titles that, in my mind, it's definitely one of the best Zelda entries. And I want to highlight, the game's not without flaws. There's definitely some deficits to it. But the things that it does well, in my opinion, it does incredibly well. And in a lot of ways, it does it better than most Zelda games before it and after it.